The first explosion sent a tremor through the ground, the kind that made Alexei Thompson's stomach tighten with a familiar sense of dread. He'd felt it before, on distant battlefields, on planets forgotten by history. But this was Earth. The place he'd sworn to protect. The place that was now under siege. "Captain!" The shout was urgent, almost frantic. Zara May, his tactical officer, appeared at his side, eyes wide, the glow of the holographic map flickering above her palm. "You need to see this." Alexei tore his gaze from the horizon, where the sky burned a blistering red, to the screen she held out. A series of alien ships, sleek, black as void, had just emerged from a crack in the atmosphere, their forms nearly impossible to track in the flickering light. They were massive, far larger than any human-made vessel. Zara's voice dropped low. "They're not even trying to hide their firepower, Alexei. This is an invasion." His mind raced, calculating the odds. Every defense system Earth had in place, the global shields, the counter-missiles, had been rendered ineffective within minutes. These ships, they weren't just advanced. They were something else entirely. "How long until impact?" he asked, his voice strained. Zara didn't look up from her screen. 30 minutes, maybe less. She glanced up finally, locking eyes with him. "We're out of time." Alexei's heart pounded, but his expression remained cool, professional. In the face of overwhelming odds, there was no room for fear. He was captain of the United Earth Defense Forces, his job was to lead, not to panic. Still, the reality of the situation was undeniable. They had no plan, no backup, and no clear way to stop the Asliel. "Is there any word from command?" Alexei asked. Zara's lips tightened. "Nothing. Communications down. I tried everything. Earth's entire defense grid is already compromised." Alexei turned sharply to the communications officer standing nearby. "Get me a line to the top brass. Now." The officer's fingers moved frantically over his console, but the silence stretched long, unbroken. "Sir, the entire network's gone dark." "Great," Alexei muttered under his breath. A bead of sweat ran down his temple, though the air inside the command center was cold, sterile. Zara watched him, noting the tightness around his jaw, the subtle twitch in his clenched hands. They both knew the truth now, Earth was alone. They were the last line of defense, and there was no escaping the Asliel. Their arrival wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. Humanity was no longer at the top of the food chain. Zara broke the silence. "We have one shot at this. There's a research facility near the East Coast. It's off the grid, but my sources say it might have a weapon capable of punching through their shields. If we don't act, we'll be wiped out before we even understand how they work." Alexei turned to face her, his mind working through the possibilities. A weapon that could breach their shields? If such a thing existed, it could be the key to survival. But there was no time to waste. "All right," he said, his voice steady but taut with urgency. "We move out immediately. Rally the closest units and get everyone ready to move out. Zara, I want a full assessment on this facility, get me every detail, no matter how small." Zara's face softened just a fraction. "You're sure about this?" Alexei met her gaze. She knew him well enough to recognize that uncertainty wasn't a luxury he could afford. "What else is there to do?" Zara gave a quick nod, then moved to relay the orders. Alexei took a moment, his eyes scanning the chaos unfolding on the screens. The Asliel warships were descending rapidly, their sleek forms carving through the sky like a dark omen. He'd faced countless enemies in his career, but none like this. None who came with such overwhelming power, such cold precision. "Captain." Zara's voice broke through his thoughts again. "We've got company. Multiple dropships incoming. We need to move, now." Alexei's blood chilled. The Asliel were already deploying troops. They were done waiting. He didn't have time to think, only to act. "Prepare the men," he barked. "We'll engage on our terms." As the alarm blared through the command center, Alexei turned toward the door, determination setting into his bones. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for Earth, for every human life still left on the planet. And he would be damned if they fell without a fight. His heart thudded as the sound of boots hitting the floor reverberated through the base, the same rhythm of countless battles past. But this time, there would be no retreat. This time, humanity's survival would depend on their ability to outsmart an enemy that thought them weak, thought them fragile. The Asliel had made a mistake. And Alexei Thompson would be the one to make them pay for it. The hum of the ship's engines vibrated through the floor of the command center as Captain Alexei Thompson paced in front of the team. The mission briefing had been short, too short, but there was no time for lengthy plans now. The Asliel were closing in on Earth faster than expected, and their relentless assault had already reduced several major cities to ashes. The only hope they had left was the mysterious facility that Zara had found, deep in the eastern wilderness. If they didn't find a way to neutralize the alien ships, humanity's countdown was almost over. Status report, Alexei snapped, his voice sharp but steady. Lieutenant Jackson, his communications officer, looked up from his console, his face pale but determined. We're on course, sir. ETA to the facility, 30 minutes. Alexei nodded curtly and turned to Zara, who was reviewing the holographic map projected before her. Her sharp eyes darted over the details, her fingers tapping the interface with practiced precision. She was the best strategist Alexei had ever worked with, and in this moment, her calm was a rare gift. You sure about this place, Zara? Alexei asked, stepping closer. No one's heard from it in years. If it's a trap. It's not, Zara cut him off, her voice low but firm. We've checked every source we could find. The data's solid. If there's any chance of saving Earth, it's there. Alexei hesitated for a moment. Trust wasn't something he gave easily, especially when the stakes were this high. But Zara had earned his trust long ago, even when things seemed impossible. He gave a short nod. All right. But we need to move fast. Once we get there, we won't have much time before the Asliel catch up. As if on cue, the ship lurched slightly, throwing everyone off balance. The sudden impact rattled the crew, a loud boom echoing from somewhere below deck. The alert lights flashed red, and an automated voice blared from the intercom. Enemy fire detected. Shields holding at 50%. Incoming missile strike in 20 seconds. Alexei's heart skipped. The Asliel had found them. The ship's hull groaned under the strain, and the temperature in the room seemed to rise. He could feel the weight of every second counting down. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. Alexei barked. Zara, get the team to their stations. Now. Zara's face hardened, her eyes narrowing. She didn't need any more orders. You heard him, people, let's move, she shouted, and the room immediately came alive with the sounds of boots on metal floors and the hurried clatter of weaponry being prepared. Alexei moved swiftly toward the cockpit, where he could see the stars streaking past through the viewport. The massive warship that had been trailing them was closing in, its silhouette now a dark blot against the flickering expanse of space. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The Asliel were relentless, and there was nowhere to hide. If they didn't shake them soon, the mission was over before it had even started. Lieutenant, can you evade them? Alexei asked, gripping the back of the pilot's seat. We'll try, the pilot replied, his voice tense. This ship's fast, but not invincible. I'll need cover fire once we're in range of the facility. Alexei's thoughts raced as the minutes passed like hours. They were running out of time. The Asliel were too close, and even with their advanced technology, there was no way to outrun them indefinitely. They had to hit the ground running and hope the facility had something, anything, that could give them a fighting chance. We're in range, the pilot announced suddenly, his voice tight with anticipation. Pulling into position now. All units, prepare to deploy. Alexei shouted. He turned to Zara, who had joined him at the cockpit's entrance, her expression unreadable. Time to make history. The ship's engines roared to life as they descended through the atmosphere, the flames of re-entry lashing against the hull. Alexei felt a jolt as the ship broke through the lower clouds, revealing the sprawling landscape below. There was nothing but wilderness for miles, untouched, uninhabited. Down there, Zara pointed toward the dense forest below. That's our target. The ground rushed up to meet them as the ship began its descent. Alexei could see the glint of metal through the trees, distant structures, possibly some form of advanced tech hidden beneath the forest floor. But before they could get any closer, a series of explosions erupted from the Asliel warship still in pursuit. A missile volley broke through their defenses, the shockwaves rattling the ship and sending a blast of heat into the cockpit. "We've got incoming," shouted the pilot, but it was too late. The ship jolted violently as the first impact hit. "Brace for impact," Alexei shouted, his grip tightening on the seat as the world outside the viewport exploded into chaos. Another missile hit, this time causing the ship to roll to one side. "Captain!" Zara's voice was sharp in his ear. "We have to drop now." Before he could respond, the ship lurched forward, and the floor buckled beneath him. The last thing Alexei saw before the world turned to black was the massive Asliel warship bearing down on them like a predator closing in for the kill. The sound of static filled his ears as Alexei slowly regained consciousness. He was lying on the cold, hard ground. His body ached from the impact, his mind struggling to piece together the fragments of the crash. "Zara," he called out hoarsely, pushing himself to his feet. No answer. The silence was deafening, save for the distant crackling of flames. His heart pounded in his chest as he took in his surroundings, the wreckage of the ship, strewn across the forest floor. It was a miracle they had survived. But there was no time to waste. The Asliel were coming. And the real fight was just beginning. The jagged remnants of the ship lay scattered across the forest floor, smoking and groaning under the weight of their crash. Alexei's head throbbed, his vision blurred, but the searing pain was nothing compared to the gravity of their situation. His hands shook as he pushed himself up, groaning as he staggered to his feet. He needed to focus. The Asliel would be here soon. "Zara?" His voice cracked as he called out, but the only response was the distant crackle of fire. His boots crunched against the dirt as he made his way toward the wreckage, each step heavy with the weight of uncertainty. "Zara," he shouted again, his throat dry, his eyes scanning the debris. There, through the smoke, he saw her. Her face was smeared with dirt, but her eyes locked onto his immediately. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. "Alexei, you're awake," she said, her voice tinged with both relief and urgency. Her hand shot up to her head as she steadied herself against the broken console. "We've got no time to waste." Alexei nodded, brushing dirt from his uniform. He could feel the adrenaline returning, flooding his system as he pulled himself together. There was no room for weakness. "Not now." "The Asliel?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "On their way." "We need to get to the facility," Zara said, her voice clipped. "It's our only shot at stopping them. If we don't reach it, this is over." The urgency in her words set fire to Alexei's resolve. He had spent years leading troops into impossible situations, but none of those missions had felt quite like this. This wasn't just another battle. This was the survival of humanity, and it had all come down to a handful of soldiers on a forgotten world, with no backup and no clear plan. Alexei glanced at the wreckage of their ship. It wasn't going anywhere, and the Asliel would undoubtedly have detected the crash by now. The forest around them, thick with towering trees, would offer little cover. He couldn't risk staying in the open. "We move now," Alexei said, his voice hardening with purpose. "Zara, lead the way." Zara's tactical mind was already working, her eyes flicking over the terrain. She nodded sharply and turned, already calculating the best route. "Follow me. Stay low. We can't afford to be seen." They moved through the underbrush in silence, the forest dense with life but eerily quiet, as if it, too, felt the impending danger. Every rustling leaf and snap of a twig felt amplified in the stillness. Alexei could feel his heart pounding, and every muscle in his body screamed for action. They had to reach that facility. No more detours, no more hesitation. After what felt like hours, they finally came upon the entrance to the hidden facility, a crumbling stone structure, half sunken into the earth, obscured by the dense forest. It looked abandoned, old, but the faintest hum of power running through the walls told a different story. Whatever secrets it held, it was still alive. "How do we get in?" Alexei asked, eyeing the thick steel doors set into the stone. Zara walked up to the door and inspected the old security panel. Her fingers flew over the controls, and within moments, the door slid open with a low, grinding sound. "Let's hope they left the keys," she muttered, glancing back at him with a wry smile. The dim light inside the facility flickered to life as they stepped in, their footsteps echoing in the cold, metallic halls. The air smelled stale, untouched by human presence for years, but it carried the faint, reassuring scent of forgotten machinery, safeguards against the approaching darkness. "What are we looking for?" Alexei asked, his voice low, as he scanned the surroundings. Zara's eyes moved over the control panels, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Weapons, anything we can use to fight back. There's a research lab on the far side of the facility. We'll start there. It's the only lead we've got." They moved through the corridors, the silence pressing in around them. Alexei's thoughts kept returning to the crash. It hadn't been a coincidence that the Asliel had found them so quickly. They had underestimated the aliens' ability to track them, and now they were behind enemy lines with only a tenuous hope of survival. But then, a low rumble cut through the building's hum, a distant thud that vibrated through the floor beneath their feet. "What was that?" Alexei hissed, immediately tensing. Zara's hand shot up, signaling him to be silent. Her eyes darted to a control panel. The lights flickered again, and this time, the sound wasn't just a vibration, it was a full tremor. The facility groaned under the pressure. "The facility's reacting," Zara whispered. "Something's activating, or someone." Before Alexei could respond, a loud hiss echoed from behind them, followed by the sound of footsteps. The Asliel had found them. "We're not alone," Zara said, her voice barely a whisper. Her hand gripped the pistol at her side as they slowly crouched behind a nearby column, waiting. Alexei's hand went to his sidearm, and he adjusted his stance, eyes scanning the darkened hallway ahead. The battle had just begun. The metallic clang of the facility doors shutting behind them reverberated through the cold, sterile halls. Alexei's heart hammered against his ribcage as the sound of distant footsteps drew closer. Each footstep echoed off the walls, a rhythmic reminder that the Asliel were closing in. The tension in the air was thick enough to slice through. Every breath Alexei took was shallow, his mind racing with the need to act, but act wisely. There was no room for mistakes. "Stay low," Zara whispered, her voice a cold breath against the heavy silence. Her eyes flicked toward the flickering emergency lights above them, calculating the timing between shadows. "They'll be patrolling this area. We move fast, and we move quiet." Alexei nodded, his hand tightening around the grip of his pistol. He could feel his pulse echo in his throat, but he held himself steady. They had no backup. No reinforcements. Just the two of them and the hope that the facility's secrets would give them an edge, if they could unlock them in time. The hall ahead of them stretched out like a tunnel of cold, forgotten technology. Rows of dormant equipment lined the walls, some covered in rust, others still faintly glowing with long-dormant energy. A sense of unease slithered up Alexei's spine. This place hadn't seen life in years, yet now, it hummed with potential. Or was it just his imagination? "We need to get to the control room," Zara murmured. "It's on the 3rd floor. If the data's correct, the facility is still connected to the main server. That's our best chance of figuring out what's in the vault below us." They moved swiftly, careful to avoid the beam of the occasional passing guard's flashlight. Their footsteps were muffled by the thick carpeting on the floors, but Alexei knew they couldn't rely on luck for long. The Asliel were methodical, efficient. The moment they made their presence known, it would be a bloodbath. Alexei's mind flashed back to the moment of the crash, the explosion that had nearly torn their ship apart. He could still feel the heat, the shockwave of the blast that had sent them plummeting to the planet's surface. They'd survived by sheer force of will. They had to keep surviving. No one else would do it for them. Zara held up a hand, signaling for him to stop. She turned to face him, her sharp eyes scanning the walls for any sign of movement. A low hum vibrated through the floor beneath them, and for a brief moment, Alexei felt a flicker of hope. The facility was coming alive again, maybe in response to their presence. There, Zara pointed down a hallway to their left. The control room. We go in, grab what we need, and get out. Quick and clean. They sprinted toward the room, hearts racing, pulses hammering, the sounds of the Asleel's movements growing louder with each passing second. Alexei's mind was a blur of strategy, his every thought focused on staying one step ahead. He had no doubt that the Asleel were smarter than they seemed, that they were tracking them, waiting for them to make a mistake. Ready? Zara's voice was low, but Alexei could hear the edge of steel in it. She was already adjusting her gear, preparing for what would come next. Always, Alexei answered, his voice as firm as he could make it. They reached the control room door, and Zara's hands flew to the interface, accessing the panel with the ease of a veteran. She wasn't just a strategist, she was a tech expert in her own right, and her skill with systems had kept them alive more than once. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dimly lit room filled with consoles and ancient screens. Alexei stepped inside first, his eyes immediately darting to the far wall. Rows of data terminals blinked to life as the facility's power surged, casting a cold blue glow across the room. Zara moved quickly, her hands already at the controls, typing at a rapid pace. She didn't need to look up to know that the Asleel were closing in. "What are we looking for exactly?" Alexei asked, his voice low, scanning the room as if expecting danger to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "Any data on weapons," Zara replied, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "Anything that can help us stop them. This is the last chance we have." As the seconds ticked by, Alexei kept his senses sharp, straining to hear the faintest sound of footsteps. Time was slipping through their fingers. "There," Zara whispered. "Got it. There's a hidden vault underneath us." "Looks like," she cut herself off, her brow furrowing as she scanned the data further. "Wait, this can't be right. It's saying the vault is filled with..." A distant thud interrupted her. Then another. Louder this time. Alexei's stomach dropped as the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. The Asleel weren't just close. They were inside. "We're out of time," Alexei growled. "Zara, finish it." She tapped furiously at the console, her face pale but determined. "Just a few more seconds." A loud crash echoed from the hallway. The door at the far end of the room slammed open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. The Asleel, tall and armored, stood there, their weapons drawn, eyes glinting with the cold intelligence of a hunter. They had found them. "Zara!" Alexei shouted, grabbing her arm. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the Asleel began to advance, their weapons aimed at the two of them. "Run," Zara hissed. Alexei's heart pounded as the first shot rang out. He didn't need another command. Without a word, he pulled Zara behind him, his mind focused on one thing: survival. But deep down, a spark of hope still burned. They weren't finished yet. Not by a long shot.